Hey guys, it's Neon. We're going to talk about the comic book industry, the state of the comic book industry, and the fact that it looks like more mainstream media outlets are picking up on the fact that the comic book industry is headed for a major crash soon, or some kind of major transition. This is what YouTubers have been talking about for years, 2, 3, 4 years. And that day of reckoning, I think, is coming very, very soon. We're seeing it this year with, a bunch of comic book shops closing, a bunch of titles being canceled. The rumor is that Warner Media might prune or end DC Comics as a publisher. They already shut down Mad Magazine. They shut down Vertigo. We don't know what the future holds for Marvel. They're jobbing out some of their titles to IDW, which itself is not doing well. Just things are in a huge state of flux right now with the comic book industry as it is, and it's gotten so bad that even Screen Rant is calling out that Spider-Man #1, even though it's selling very well, might be an indicator that a huge crash is going to come. Sort of the second wave that took out a big chunk of the comic book industry in the late 90s. This might be the tsunami that does the direct market in for good. That this might be the end. I don't know. Who knows? So we're going to talk about that in this video. Before we get started, please subscribe to the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, it's definitely appreciated. The support is appreciated. We passed 62,000 subs, I think, this week. We're hoping for 100,000 by the end of the year. Don't know if that's possible, but if you guys could give us a sub, it would be greatly appreciated. It helps us bring you content and give our hot takes on whatever the hell's going on from day to day in pop culture, and some of that includes comic books. So we'll talk about Spider-Man #1 here in a little bit in this Screen Rant article. Before we do that, though, I want to go out to a tweet that was actually brought to my attention by Geeky, who got it from Aaron Sparrow. Jim Steranko, comic book legend Jim Steranko, probably best known for his Nick Fury covers, etc., is just wising up to the fact that Ollie's has a bunch of comic books that can't be sold. And we've been talking about that off and on this channel for a couple of months. Every once in a while, I'll make a trip to Ollie's Bargain Outlet, and you will find piles and piles and piles of newish comic books. Jim Steranko says something odd happened in the past week, and I wondered if any of you experienced a similar situation. I was in a store that specialized in remainder closeout merchandise and noted the book section featured an impressive selection of new but not quite recent comic books. Yeah, Mr. Steranko, this is not a good situation. This is basically where the comic book industry is going to die. They're dumping pallets full, trucks full of unsold comic books into Ollie's, and they're selling them very, very cheap. How and why they get there, I have no idea. I've been trying to figure out exactly what's going on with Ollie's. If any of you have any information, it would be appreciated. I don't know if they come from comic shops that have gone out of business. I don't know if it's overstock and overprints from Diamond, which Everett Todd seems to suggest is going on, that Diamond is actually quote-unquote shipping more books than they actually are, if they're leftover books from Marvel and DC's warehouses. I don't know where these books come from. I have no idea, but I know that they've been sitting there clogging up shelf space for years, and there doesn't seem to really be an end to that anytime soon. I will link to a couple of videos we've done on that here on Clownfish TV. Last year, I just stopped covering it because I didn't think it was newsworthy. Everybody knows that Marvel and DC and Boom and IDW, they all dump their books off at Ollie's, but it does seem to be more Marvel books. From what I can tell, there are more Marvel books, and a lot of them recent, Captain Marvel, Civil War II, a lot of these, quote-unquote hits, these big selling books, the Captain America Nazi books, all this stuff they're dumping off at Ollie's, this unsold stock. And I mean, that's got to make it hard for comic shops too, because they carry a lot of the same stuff, and you can't compete with, a $4.99 hardcover. It's crazy. So let's get into the meat of this, and we're going to talk about the comic book industry not doing well. I don't see this reversing course anytime soon. Before we talk about Spider-Man #1 in particular, just want to point out a few things here. IDW is still hemorrhaging money. They lost another $1.5 million in Q3. They're losing money rapidly, and what they're talking about is all the success they're having with their TV pilots that they're trying to get picked up. We don't know what's going to happen, but they did launch Clover Press earlier this year, which is kind of weird. It looks like Clover Press is basically what IDW was, and I have to wonder if it isn't another company that they're just going to start moving stuff over to Clover Press and just let IDW burn. They've been trying to sell it. I guess they're trying to get it ready to sell, but it's losing money. It's a money losing proposition. IDW doesn't really own a lot. They do a lot of licensed books, and I think now they're trying to focus again on, creator owned content, but they're about 10 years too late. I think for that. So IDW obviously not doing well, and if there is a comic book crash, companies like IDW and Boom are going to be the first casualties. Absolutely. Looking out at ICV2, the big comic book industry site here. I tweeted this the other day. We talked about how the comic book industry is basically flatlining. It's basically flatlining. And I won't go into numbers, but they are having some hits with the X-Men books and a couple of other number ones, but that can't last forever. And that leads into the Spider-Man number one, that basically Marvel and DC have to resort to gimmicks to boost sales. We saw this in the 90s. It's happening again. This is interesting though. They're talking about, and this is a month that had, some pretty big hits, relatively speaking, but they're talking about how the industry is flat. It's basically flatlined, and that's with these X books. That's with, I think, Marvel Comics 1000 and some other, pretty big books. It's flatlining. The comic book industry is not going to get better. The comic book industry is on its deathbed right now. The direct market, anyway. I don't think comics as an art form is ever going to go away. But the way that comics are sold and distributed, if it's going to continue, it's going to have to change. And unfortunately, comic shops are going to be a casualty of that. They already are. It's not sustainable. For most people, it's not sustainable to sell the numbers that you need to sell to stay in business. The margins are bad, but things are flatlining, and the industry is kind of celebrating stagnation. Like, hey guys, at least we're not bleeding out. We're treading water. We didn't drown yet, but they're going to drown eventually. It's going to get tired. It's not going to be able to even tread water. And it's all gonna drown. And now Screen Rant is catching on, and he's, this is Thomas Bacon from Screen Rant saying that Spider-Man number one doing well is a serious problem. Now, I think we had somebody offer us a code on Twitter. I didn't take him up on that. I might check it out eventually, but I have no interest. It's J.J. Abrams and his kid writing a Spider-Man book. Not interested. I'm just not interested in it, but it is selling well, I guess. But it's also part of a big problem. They're saying that we're looking at the potential for another massive crash, and the comic book industry has already been weakened at this point. It can't withstand another crash. The first crash in the 90s, the comic book industry was coming off of an industry high. There was money to be had. The money was flowing like wine. We had, the Image guys were making money. Everybody's selling a ton of books. Everybody's making bank, and then it just all ended, and nobody really saw that. They thought that things were going to continue that way forever, and the comic book industry never fully recovered. It kind of reminds me of Frodo in Lord of the Rings, where he had a mortal wound, but it never fully healed. And now he's just tired and he wants to go into the West, and that's kind of, I think, what's going to happen with the comic book industry. I think the first mortal wound was the big crash in the 90s. And decisions that have happened over the last decade in particular have just continued to erode at whatever was left. The industry never fully recovered. It never fully recovered from the crash. And now this could be the death blow if that happens again. So again, coming from Screen Rant, sales of Henry and J.J. Abrams Spider-Man number one are going through the roof. I don't know what it's actually selling, and we have to wait until next month, I guess, to see how many copies they actually shipped. While that may seem like good news in the short term, it's worryingly reminiscent of the comic book market crash in the 90s. Could the same enticing sales lead to the same old problems? They're talking about how they're going to make history with a new Spider-Man series, and they've managed to do it by introducing a brand new Spider-Man hero. But even before the issue released, comic book site Bleeding Cool dropped a rumor the Abrams Spider-Man series was set in a future timeline starring Peter Parker and Mary Jane's son Ben, suggesting that it could be the previously established timeline of Mayday Spider-Girl Parker. The result was impressive, to say the least. I haven't read it yet. I'll admit I haven't read it. I might check it out. I don't know. We'll see. Sales figures jumped with standard copies of Spider-Man 1 retailing for $9 on eBay and rarer copies selling for more. Spider-Girl 59, the comic that introduced Mayday's little brother Ben, promptly sold out on eBay, going for $15 a copy. The original cover of Spider-Girl 59 was posted and sold for a whopping $1,800. The irony, of course, is that Bleeding Cool's reports were only half right. Bleeding Cool's not 100% right. Abrams' series is indeed set in a future timeline, but it's an entirely original one, completely unconnected to Spider-Girl. So, long-term comic readers will recognize the pattern, since it's the same one seen in the 90s when speculators began to scoop up comics, believing first issues, variant covers, historic twists, and events would become valuable in the long run. Ironically, all their purchasing did was urge publishers like Marvel to make more stock, actually driving the ultimate value of the product down instead. Yeah, the reason those classic comics are worth so much, beyond the fact that they were first appearances of major characters, because frankly a lot more comics were printed back in the day. It's because comics were disposable. Everybody's parents, everybody's moms cleaned their rooms, and they threw out their Amazing Fantasy 15. They threw out their X-Men #1. So that's why they're worth something now. People didn't think to hold on to comics. Now they're holding on to all kinds of comics. Speaking of ollies, you can still find 90s Image comics in bags at Ollie's. Like, they've got bundles of unsold Image comics from the 1990s, 20-plus-year-old comic books, still in the bag for sale for next to nothing, and they still can't sell them because they're not worth anything, because everybody bought these comics and they held on to them thinking they were going to be worth money. So when the speculators finally realized they were being played for fools, they stopped buying, and the comic book retailers closed down by the hundreds. They're doing it again. They're not really closing down by the hundreds, but they are closing down by the dozens. We've seen it for the last 2 years in particular, with the biggest complaint being the new Marvel comics, the new, maybe DC to a certain extent, but definitely Marvel, that the new stock is not sellable. I know one of my favorite comic book shops flat out said they're not carrying new issues anymore. They're only dealing in back issues because they can't sell the new stuff. Nobody wants the Squirrel Girl or the 50th reboot of Captain Marvel. They just don't want it. So regardless of intent, Marvel Comics is following all the same strategies that caused their problems in the 90s. Gone are the days when a Marvel comic could run past 100. Yeah, they're getting rebooted at like issue 10, issue 6. The books are now relaunched just about every time a new creative team takes over, with the first issue marketed as an event. Deadpool's had 5 relaunches since 2008. I think Captain Marvel might have actually had more. Meanwhile, Marvel is commissioning countless variant covers each month, with retailers encouraged to purchase certain levels to receive limited edition variants. Again, this is familiar. The end result is an artificially inflated sales figure, leaving non-variant stock on shelves. Spider-Man 1's sales now hint at that speculators are returning in full force. Yeah, because they got Hollywood involved. Hey everybody, J.J. Abrams, the Hollywood guy, he's writing Spider-Man #1. It's the #1. You know how much the other Spider-Man #1's worth? You know how much Amazing Fantasy 15 is worth? Yeah, this is a Hollywood guy. Come buy this Hollywood guy's comic book. Meanwhile, other 90s era mistakes continue to seem tempting. Corporate ownership, like most industries, has nudged the bottom line back up as a priority over books readers want to keep buying, and they put that in italics. Good on you, sir. That also means a step away from real risk-taking, with a net slide towards socially conservative content. Some could argue that the slide away from socially conservative content has actually driven away a lot of readers, but I digress. Alpha Flight served as an unexpected lightning rod when Scott Lobdell wrote an issue in which North Star declared he was gay, while they also talk about Nomad being HIV positive, etc., etc. Marvel Comics 1000, intended as an anniversary issue, became controversial when Marvel edited a politically aware note by writer Mark Waid on American self-identity, while Marvel dropped an essay by Pulitzer Prize-winning comic book writer Spiegelman for referring to Donald Trump as the Orange Skull. So Marvel Comics sold well, and Abrams' Spider-Man #1 will do the same, but the sales figures conceal much below the surface. Marvel superheroes may not be, or may be bigger than ever on the big screen, but the comic industry is certainly not booming. Okay, so yeah, and he ends with, if Marvel starts repeating the mistakes that led to the collapse of the industry in the 90s, the road ahead could be bumpy. for comic book readers. It's definitely going to be bumpy for creators. It's very, very hard to make a living working on corporate comics these days. So look, I mean, obviously some people are going to disagree with his takeaway that they need to be more progressive. Comics need to take more chances. But the overall gist is the same, right? It's the comic book industry's in dire straits right now. It really is. And YouTubers have been talking about it for quite some time. And, you know, they talk about it and they're actually attacked by industry professionals for pointing out the elephant in the room. And if it's gotten bad enough that a progressive writer for Screen Rant is calling out the same shenanigans, then things are bad. You know, maybe it's time that everybody put aside or stop playing the blame game and figure out how to fix the comic book industry. You know, I mean, the writing has been on the wall for years. And only now are people starting to react. And again, the opinions that, for the most part, that Thomas Bacon are giving in this article are opinions that a lot of YouTubers have had, that the comic book industry is headed for another massive crash. And again, I don't know if debating about the hows and the whys really do any good at this point. I think that, you know, the fact that everybody needs to get on the same page and be like, can we save this? You know, can we save it? Can we have disagreements? Can we have, you know, political disagreements or whatever? And can we save the comic book industry or not? I don't know. I think personally, I think the damage is done. I think the industry suffered a fatal stab wound 20 years ago, and it's just been becoming more and more gangrenous as the decades ticked on. And it has really escalated in the past couple of years for various reasons, not just, you know, fans getting tired of the politics or whatever, but also the fact that the way people consume media is changing, that there's so much more competition now, that comic books have gotten ridiculously expensive, that, you know, we've got Amazon, for crying out loud. If you're going to buy graphic novels, most people are just going to go to Amazon. So there are a number of reasons. The point of this being is that if everybody, regardless of political ideology, is on the same page that the comic book industry needs to be fixed, then everybody needs to sit down and figure out how to make that happen. Hey guys, thanks for watching Clownfish TV. Please consider supporting the channel. Go to clownfishsupport.com. That's clownfishsupport.com. And if you want to join our community, go to clownfishtalk.com. That's clownfishtalk.com. Please subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. We will talk to you next time.